Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, February the 5th, 2026. Yesterday, we did a show with the journalist Christopher Mathias, who has a new book out, To Catch a Fascist, the fight to expose the radical right, that seemed to suggest that Antifa has a right to unmask neo-Nazis. And we had an interesting conversation about the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville back in 2017 and whether one has the right or not to expose people who were involved in that rally. It's all, of course, about privacy and indeed shame. We are again talking about privacy today, perhaps in a more legal way, with my guest, Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, who has a new book out. Your data will be used against you, Policing in the Age of Self-Surveillance. Andrew is joining us from Washington, D.C. He teaches law at GW Law School. Andrew, I know this is beyond perhaps the focus of your book, but when it comes to exposing what people are up to in their political lives, what is your take on this extremely controversial issue? Controversial, of course, both on the left and the right.
I think it points to a point that is discussed in the book, although I don't obviously touch on that issue, which is that our data exposes us, it exposes everyone. Whoever is communicating with some kind of digital device in their pocket is exposed, and it has a duality to it, right? Sometimes it's useful for law enforcement to find people. Sometimes people who are protesting and dissenting get exposed, and as you were just talking about, it can work the other way around. The point is, maybe it was in your earlier discussion, that there really aren't really laws or rules or regulation or constitutional protections about this data. My focus in the book is about how the police and prosecutors and the government can use data against us. But obviously, this sort of exposure of data has a double edge.
Yeah, and a very sharp double edge, unfortunately. Eric Schmidt, when he was CEO of Google back in, I think it was 2008 or 9, famously said about online privacy, you shouldn't be ashamed of anything you do, or if you are ashamed, don't do it. How would you respond to that? At that point at least, was a fairly typical Silicon Valley response to the issue of privacy. Now I think it's a little bit more nuanced.
Well, I think the really hard questions about data privacy in general and about what information Google could collect, I think they're actually more narrow and tailored and perhaps solvable issues about controlling what the government can do with that information. So, for example, I do like the fact that I can Google in a search query whatever I'd like to query, and I would wish that data could stay between me and Google and not necessarily be turned into evidence against me in a court of law. And part of what the book does is rationalize or wrestle with that tension. There is a reason why we all have accepted sort of the seduction of self-surveillance. There's a reason why we buy, watches that monitor our heartbeat or buy cameras that we put on our front door. There's a reason for that. But what I don't think we've really wrestled with is that data that we create can be used against us in a court of law, and has been and will be, and that presents its own danger. So in the book, I actually propose solutions not for Google collecting our data or data privacy or data protection writ large, but more about how to regulate government use of it and prosecution use of it against individuals.
Does it depend, of course, on how one views government and its rights in terms of citizens? I mean, what rights should government have, Andrew, when it comes to what you call policing in the age of self-surveillance?
Well, I think there are certain things that we would like to keep private. Let me give you a good example. So I think we can all agree that a digital pacemaker, something that goes in your heart that keeps your heart beating and records your heartbeat and gives it to your doctor, is a good. It's an objective good. That is saving lives. It's important, and it's something that we should be investing in for innovation and everything else. At the same time, we might also agree that that data about your smart heartbeat should not be available to detectives who can go to your doctor's door with a warrant and get it and use it against you in a court of law. And that's happened in a case I discuss in the book. And I think that balance is there. The person being charged in that case was arguably committing a crime, but that's his heartbeat being used against him. And I think that we should be able to design laws that balance that very good need for having digital conveniences and innovations that have changed our world for good, but at the same time, controlling how that information can be used against us.
Give me more details on that heartbeat case. Why did the police want to use his heartbeat? And what was the crime and what was the outcome?
So there's this guy who basically was committing a insurance fraud using arson. He was burning down his house, and he came up with this whole story about how he had rescued everything right in time, and he told this, it's an elaborate lie about this in order to get the insurance money, which again is a crime. And so detectives wanted to disprove his story by showing that his heartbeat wasn't responding the way it would have been if you were running around in the middle of a fire trying to save all of your possessions. So they went and they got the heartbeat and they used it against him, and he was sort of convicted based on his own heartbeat. And again, that's a hard story. Like, this is a crime. It's something that we don't want to support. At the same time, this is intimate data that really was sort of involuntary given. Like, I guess he could have chosen not to have a pacemaker and not stay alive. But once you have that, it seems like we might be able to carve out protections about certain sensitive data, certain information that maybe we don't want the government to have.
What's been the typical response, Andrew, of Silicon Valley when it comes to this issue of self-surveillance and the data that can be used by the police? I know Apple in particular have been quite resistant to opening iPhones for the police for one reason or other. Can one make some rules about Silicon Valley's commitment or lack of commitment to providing data for the police?
Well, I think the problem is that currently the only protections are really coming from the companies themselves. There really isn't a law that controls it. Even if you're thinking about, Google, which has been collecting sort of location data and came up with its own 3-part warrant, so law enforcement could get access to this, or what they call the sensor vault, basically all of our location data. But it was Google's lawyers who actually came up with the idea of having this 3-step process. It wasn't like a judge saying this is what the Fourth Amendment holds, or this is a legislative determination. It was like Google's lawyers. Now, that case is actually going before the Supreme Court, just got granted cert. It's going up to be decided. But again, the point is the companies making these calls. So Apple has seen it that it's in their business interest to be more privacy protective. Google has essentially sold you a cheaper phone, but made the money back on the data that they were collecting from that phone. And unfortunately now, of course, all of those tech companies are somewhat beholden to a governmental administration in the US that is, playing pretty tough. And I think it'd be hard for companies to push back the same way that they had when they have all these other large government contracts at issue. Apple is sort of in a different boat than Microsoft or Google or Amazon or any of those other big companies.
What rights can and should we have when it comes to these issues? I know that you focus in your book on the Fourth Amendment. You might explain what the Fourth Amendment is and how it connects. But if one is indeed guilty of a crime, burning down the house in order to get insurance money, why shouldn't the government use any kind of data it can get access to make its case if indeed we are guilty?
Well, that is actually almost the current law, right? That if you create data, it can be used against you. In fact, the truth of the matter is there is nothing too private, too secret that the government can't access with a warrant. So, your digital diary, your period app, your health monitor, your smart bed, whatever it is, if the government can get a warrant to get access to it, and sometimes they don't even need a warrant, they can use it. And so that is the current default. I think that default devalues sort of a sense of not just privacy, but also gives the government more control. I think that we've seen potential abuses of that technology, that sort of use of surveillance technology, even in the last month or two, where we've seen a government that has seen fit to go after journalists and podcasters and protesters who are out on the streets. And so I think that we might want to have a balance. I actually think it's a kind of a bipartisan issue because you never know who's going to be in charge of the government, but we might want to have a balance about should there be higher limits, maybe something more than a warrant to be able to get access to this? Should there be particular areas that are just so private, so intimate that the police can't get it no matter what? That might lie under a Fourth Amendment understanding of a reasonable.
Just explain, sorry, Andrew, for our non-legal audience, what the Fourth Amendment is.
Sure. So the Fourth Amendment comes from the United States Constitution that governs unreasonable searches and seizures, so taking things, but also taking data. The Supreme Court has said that the controlling standard is whether or not we all have a reasonable expectation of privacy in something. What that means in a digital age, it's honestly kind of an open question, still being debated. The court has said in a case called Carpenter that your cell site location data, so the data that's revealed when you walk around the world, requires a warrant to get access to it. But there have been many other pieces of information where the court has held that there is no quote unquote reasonable expectation of privacy, and police can get it for any reason or no reason just because they want it. So you could have a system where you could have a warrant, or you could even, and this is some of the proposals in the book, go even beyond that to say maybe there's certain areas that should be essentially privileged. It's like when a client and a lawyer are talking, there's something called an attorney-client privilege, where those communications just can't be used in court. When two married people are speaking, that communication is privileged. Why? Because we value something else besides the ability to use data against someone in a court. We value the sanctity of marriage. We value the sanctity of an attorney-client privilege. And I think that there are some pieces of our digital world that also deserve that kind of privilege, or so I make the argument in the book.
This isn't going to make the police very happy, is it?
No, it's not. I think the police and honestly the tech companies sort of like the status quo, where there really isn't regulation. The Fourth Amendment is still debating things in kind of an analog pre-digital world. And that means the technology proceeds apace. And sometimes, the book is honestly filled with stories of uses that get a bad guy and lock him up. And I wrestle with that, honestly. I'm trying to show that there is a positive to it. But I also think the danger of that is that same data can be used to, track a police officer's ex-girlfriend, or as we're seeing in Minneapolis, go after protesters or people who are using their First Amendment rights in ways that are deeply uncomfortable, that the police, without the proper requirements, or even if you call something a crime, everything becomes available, that you can use the same power in a real authoritarian way.
You used the Minnesota example, the Minneapolis example, Andrew, but a lot of people would argue, outside the law, that the current regime, and certainly the behavior of ICE in Minneapolis, is unconstitutional, perhaps even illegal. So can that example really be used? I mean, you can always find examples of the police or a state overstepping the boundaries, but that in itself doesn't mean that there shouldn't be laws, should there?
I do think that there should be laws. In fact, the book is filled with suggestions that there should be laws, but there are not. And what's really chilling is that the technologies that ICE and the Customs Border Patrol are using right now in Minneapolis can be used by local law enforcement or the FBI in the same way. And there isn't a clear sense that it is automatically unconstitutional. You have to wait for the Supreme Court to claim that it is, or state that it is. And that we are seeing, and this is what's interesting, we are seeing a very aggressive use of new technologies, new surveillance technologies, as we've never seen before, against a otherwise relatively privileged population that was not normally the target of surveillance. And so like the aperture of surveillance has expanded to target people who weren't normally targeted. And suddenly everyone's saying, well, this feels a little too much. Whereas that same technology can be used against anyone unless there was a countervailing law or constitutional rule saying it can't be. And right now, we don't really have that.
How aggressive has the police become? I know that there are lots of cases in which it seems as if local police forces are becoming increasingly greedy for data. There's one example where the Texas State Police has more than doubled their drone fleet. Are there great differences between state police forces, and are there any guidelines on what the police can and can't do in terms of collecting data about us?
There are no like external guidelines. Obviously, police departments themselves might write the rules that limit themselves, but there's no federal law or state law that's going to control it. There are actually, for drones, as that example, there are a few like FAA laws that sort of control like safety issues around, drones flying ahead. But in terms of like, we have many cities now that are adopting drones as first responders. So imagine a 911 call goes out, a drone responds before the police officer, taking a video of what's happening there, which again, from a tactical strategy perspective for the police is very helpful for them. They can, if you have a real-time crime center, which again is a new sort of idea of like fusing all these video streams together, analysts at the real-time crime center can see what's going on with the drone. They can then go to the various cameras that are right around the area. They can even like get access to like the police officer's body camera and be able to see what's going on. Incredibly powerful change for police to get eyes on the ground quickly, but there aren't real like external rules about what they can do with that data. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. But it's definitely a change, and it's a change that we haven't talked about. Part of the book, which is on the theme of self-surveillance, is sort of this democratic self-surveillance. So this is like a mediated democratic self-surveillance where we have chosen to spend our tax dollars on these camera systems and these drones. And I think we should have a debate about whether we're okay with them.
When it comes to these kinds of debates, do American citizens tend to be somewhat paranoid? There's more and more fear of big tech on lots of different fronts, especially with AI. And I want to talk about AI a little bit later in our conversation. But where do we get balance in terms of this conversation? On the one hand, we have legal scholars like yourself. On the other hand, we have sort of hardcore libertarians who don't believe that the government have any rights to any information about us. What is the model for beginning to figure this stuff out? Is it back in the 19th century, the beginning of the mass printing press?
Well, I do think we are on like a moment of evolution, if not revolution, about the power of surveillance. And you can just look at China and see what happens when you have a city that is like just covered in cameras everywhere you go. And it's not just cameras, it's video analytics like baked into the camera, so you can identify individuals and objects and where they've gone and whether they're doing anything right or wrong. And then connecting all those data sets to who they are and what they do and their social credit score and the rest. Like, we actually have the technology in the world. In America, we're sort of developing it in our local way because policing is a very local business. And so people aren't necessarily putting all the pieces together to see this kind of change in law. But I think when you have, it's a change in technology, but when you have that kind of change in technology and really change in power, we should have a corresponding change in law and have these debates about whether we are okay. And it is true that there will be people who are completely against any surveillance technology. And then there'll be people who are actually very, pro technology because they sort of like the, if we watch everything, nothing bad will happen. And then hopefully we can have a debate about how to give the data that we need if we really need it in a particular case, but maybe protect other interests like First Amendment interests, religious interests, medical interests. Like, do you really need automated license plate camera outside the, medical clinic or the, AA meeting or any of those things? Like, we could have that debate. It is hard, but it's doable.
You bring up the China example and their notorious social credit system. There are lots of cameras around the world, not just in China. In London, for example, I think there are more cameras in London than anywhere else. But the UK still has a constitutional system as opposed to the authoritarian system in China. Can one distinguish then between types of government? I think I've already asked this question, but some governments are more responsible in terms of how they use this data. And how would you compare European models? Obviously, you've mentioned China with the US.
Well, I think what's interesting is I think that the origin story of how we reached this point where we have essentially built a surveillance state almost where we can do this kind of tracking and monitoring of people, but haven't panicked yet, is in part because up until right about this moment in American history, the people using the technology were somewhat moderated and even somewhat concerned. Like the Biden administration was doing internal checks. They had, an AI policy. They clearly were hearing voices of civil libertarians and activists who were against it. And there was a sense of restraint. I think what just has happened just in the last few months is that we've seen that there are no restraints. The norms are gone. There is no law or constitutional law to fill it. And so we're in a point here in America where the parallels to China are actually stronger than they were, 2 years ago. And, and maybe you can look to other governments that would do it wisely. And again, many European cities have pretty elaborate surveillance systems. People don't seem quite as worried about it. But an election can change that, and we can see how power can be used or misused, or how the people targeted can change.
There's a huge debate, probably outside your sphere of interest, Andrew, about the crisis of democracy and the threat of authoritarianism. Do you think one reason why the American democracy seems to be in crisis and we have this shift towards authoritarianism is this emerging panopticon? I mean, we can blame it all, of course, on Trump or Stephen Miller or somebody within ICE, but are there structural reasons why democracy seems to be increasingly in crisis in the digital age, where the government knows more and more about us through our self-surveillance?
I'm sure people have made that argument and can make that argument. I think that what's interesting now is that the Trump administration has sort of seen the potential of this surveillance that has been there. I mean, again, the Biden administration was investing in a lot of this technology. They were building out the real-time crime centers. They were, fighting against, Ron Wyden, Senator Wyden's, like, the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act. Like, there was push, like the Biden administration was building this out, but I think they thought they were doing it wisely. And it's only now where there's this aggressive use of technology that I think the Trump administration has realized, wow, if we there's these companies that will sell us this data and we could track anyone we want. Right now, maybe we're focused on, undocumented people or people protesting ICE, but we could use this for anything. And I think they may be waking up to this power. And I think that this is a moment where people who are now the new targets of this power are frightened about it. But my point to them, and even to the Trump administration, is President Trump's data was used against him. They actually went back and used his data, his texts, and this is a bipartisan fear. Whoever's in power may well abuse this power, and thus we should have rules and regulations and limits so we will prevent this foreseeable danger.
When it comes to the right to privacy of the American founders, who do you think was the wisest? We began this conversation talking about Charlottesville, of course, the home of Thomas Jefferson. I'm guessing in terms of this conversation and the appearance of a panopticon-like architecture in America, would be turning in his grave. But did some of the founders anticipate any of this?
I think so. So at the end of the book, I talk about the Tyrant test, and I sort of use as a metaphor, but also a plan of action, where the Tyrant test says we should imagine the worst. Imagine the tyrant.
The Tyrant test.
Tyrant test. So
yeah.
the solution, one of the solutions at the end of the book is called the Tyrant test. And it basically says we should imagine the worst. We should imagine the tyrant reading your most embarrassing Google queries and finding out everywhere you've gone. And then we should plan accordingly. So, what would we do structurally? These are big questions. They involve big answers. There have to be legislative changes. There have to be judicial changes. We need to have a division of power between federal and state and like community, maybe even have things like juries and grand juries. And I say, the model for this tyrant test is America, right? The founding fathers were concerned about the idea of any entity having too much power. So they tried to split it apart, tried to have contested places of power. And we should do the same thing with data and digital surveillance. We should create checks, rights, and remedies. We should have limits of juries and grand juries who could sort of vet whether we want this kind of surveillance technology in their community. And we have to have legislative protections and judicial acts, like judges have to actually maybe act to protect individuals when the Fourth Amendment is at issue. And if we do all of the above, and I try to lay them out in a more sophisticated way than I'm saying here in the book, we're moving forward. It's not going to be a solution to every problem we have, but it's definitely better than what we have now, which is essentially nothing.
What we have now, of course, is AI moving very fast. There was a recent story about Perplexity's public safety deal alarming experts when it comes to policing the police AI. How does AI change all this, Andrew?
So it's interesting. AI is changing surveillance because it's kind of supercharging it. So think about the cameras that we've had on our city streets for ages now. Like everyone's kind of familiar with these cameras, right? But now imagine them all going back to that real-time crime center described, and then being able to track or identify any object. So man, woman, child, bus, van, blue Subaru, Tesla, whatever it is, and be able to separate out all those objects and then track them back in time. It's like a time machine. And the way we do that is AI, right? We basically can train the AI to match, like, this is what a Tesla looks like. This is what a Cybertruck looks like. This is what, a Ford looks like. And we have trained the video surveillance so that we have turned ordinary cameras into something wholly new, which is a system of tracking in major cities that have, cameras. Like Chicago has over 32,000 cameras. Like we are developing our own panopticon of sorts in this way. And behind that is AI. We'll see other smaller pieces. I just read an article about AI-assisted police reports. So it's not in the book, but it's the idea of you can take the audio from a body camera footage and turn it into a pre-printed ChatGPT police report that then becomes the basis of the arrest, prosecution, and the rest of the criminal justice system going forward. Fascinating new technology, changing the relationship between police and the community, and we're just going to see more of it.
It was interesting in my conversation with Mathias, we talked about the rights and wrongs of wearing masks. From his point of view, he thinks that the left or Antifa have a right to expose the identity of people on the far right and that they have no right, people working for ICE, to wear masks. What's your take on masks and anonymity in public?
Well, I haven't read his book, so I apologize. But
yeah, and he's not. And to be fair, he's anything but a legal scholar. He's a polemicist. He's a guy on the left. So I'm not trying to compare, but I'm curious as to your thinking on our legal right to anonymity. On the right, for example, to wear masks if we want to go to a white supremacist rally or a Antifa rally. Should we have that right?
It's sort of outside my expertise, but just sort of spitballing here. I think that individuals should be able to choose whether to mask or not, and thus keep a measure of anonymity when they protest, because it probably cuts both ways. I don't think law enforcement should. I think there's a real troubling reality that we're seeing masked law enforcement just because we really want a government and police power that's accountable. Like the whole, sense of why we might trust giving over sort of this carceral power to someone else is because we should implicitly trust that they're following rules, that they understand what they're doing, and there's a transparent way to hold them accountable when they don't follow those rules. I think masking and not having badge numbers and not doing all the things that we normally have with local policing undermines that. But for ordinary citizens, like I understand why, I think there's a value in anonymity, and protest.
All sorts of debates endlessly, Andrew. Again, you don't need me to tell you this about the rise or fall of crime. Every administration seems to be obsessed with it, Trump in particular. When Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century came up with his idea of the panopticon, where everything could be seen, it wasn't that people would actually, everything would be seen, but that people would fear they were being watched, which would enable them, or at least in Bentham's utilitarian mind, to behave themselves, to obey the law, whether it was in prisons or schools or hospitals. Could one make the argument, perhaps in a utilitarian sense, that all these cameras are actually good because it means that people are breaking the law less?
I think that's the rationale of the Chinese government for putting them on their streets. But I think there's a countervailing argument that, the utilitarian argument necessarily suppresses the outlier, the dissenter, the voice that people don't want to hear or see, and that's pretty American. The idea of being able to do what you want, even if it's uncomfortable to other people. And so I'm not sure we necessarily live in a utilitarian world in that sense. I'm not sure it necessarily works. Like we've had lots of deterrence. We have deterrence in, cameras and, 7-Elevens that still get robbed. And it's not necessarily it works in that same way. But I think it is an understandable argument. And I think that it is an argument that needs to be pushed back again because I don't think we want to live in a world where the government can see everything we do and thus judge us for us and possibly penalize us for it. Especially if that data would then be used to prosecute you, like it can be in China, where if you jaywalk, you can get your old face put up on the side and they ticket you for it.
I don't think anyone watching is necessarily sympathetic to the Chinese state. But if we had technology, if we carry cameras or smartphones or AI devices around with us, which we're increasingly doing, which will reveal everything we're doing, and it did indeed radically reduce crime, what should a government do? Should a civilized government, in a sense, in this context at least, believe that a degree of crime isn't a bad thing when it comes to freedom?
I think the danger in that sentence is the definition of crime, right? So if crime is seeking out an abortion for your daughter in Texas or Idaho or a place that's
Then
criminalized,
aren't you just questioning the nature of the law and saying that if you don't approve of the law, you have the right to break it?
Well, I think that the danger is like when protest becomes criminalized, then it's all about who's defining the crime. I think we could come to a compromise about saying, there's certain crimes and certain times where some of this technology can be very useful. And we should have rules about how you get access to it and when you can't get access to it and how you can abuse it. But I think the one thing we do know is if you had that magical power where everyone was being watched and everything was being controlled by one person, it would most certainly be abused. And it would be abused for political reasons, for personal reasons, for financial reasons. And I think I would rather live in a world where we didn't have that and we can deal with a little level of some crime that probably is still going to exist even when you have the cameras there, but isn't going to be misused in that sort of tyrannical way. And I think that is what would happen. I would bet good money that's what will happen.
For better or worse, Andrew, we seem to be living in the future. There's a movie coming out this year called Mercy, about an AI world in which intentionality reveals whether or not one's guilty. Technology is moving so fast. How is this going to impact criminality and indeed intentionality? Can one be guilty of intent of crimes if one thinks in that way?
So if you take criminal law, you learn about how we as a society don't punish people based on thoughts alone. you learn that we require some kind of act. And so I imagine that whatever, AI Hollywood wants to create, whether it's Minority Report, which is the earlier version of Mercy, probably, although I haven't seen the
Yeah,
movie.
Minority Report, of
Right.
course, covered that.
Right. I mean, again, A, it will be wrong, and B, it still hopefully will require people to do some kind of act, so it's not just in your head. But more so, if we have these changes, we should have corresponding legal responses. That if we're going to change the nature of power between police and prosecutors and ordinary people, we need to rebalance the protections for those people as well. Because if we just like follow the technology, it's probably going to have not be a happy ending to that movie.
Yeah, I'm not sure there is a very happy ending to that particular movie, Andrew. In our age of self-surveillance, people are going to be watching this and getting really, I think, very nervous, probably thinking to themselves, I've got to give up my smartphone. I'm not going to go out. I don't want to be seen by cameras. What's your advice to people when it comes to this avalanche of data, self-surveillance and otherwise? Should people consider turning their phones off most of the time, especially when they're doing something, shall we say, morally dubious, if not breaking the law?
I think as a general matter, like turning your back on new technology just isn't going to be a workable solution, right? We live by our smartphones and our smart cars. You can't even buy a car now that isn't tracking you with some device. Like that is the norm. And so we should have laws to protect it. And again, my argument in the book isn't that we need to have like data privacy laws, although we should. I hope someone, does the hard job of figuring out the data privacy, data protection world. But this is like, should this data necessarily be used against us in a court of law? And then, if so, what are the rules by which you would do it? Maybe the current like warrant system, and for many of the data we're talking about, you don't even need a warrant, but the warrant system might be 2 weeks. So maybe you need something stronger. And we can actually solve that problem. The bigger data protection problem of then having to hide your phone is going to be difficult. But we could pass laws tomorrow saying, you know what, the government can't use this data against you in a court of law. Google can still use it to sell you products, but the government can't use it to prosecute you. We haven't had that world. That is sort of a revolutionary, counterintuitive world, but we could have the best of both worlds if we wanted to make these difficult decisions.
Well, I think the one thing we've learned from this conversation, Andrew, is that if you are planning to burn down your own house and claim the insurance money, don't use a heart monitor. Is that right?
That is definitely a helpful tip about being careful that every smart device you own is a surveillance device.
Well, on that helpful note, for anyone planning to burn down your house, put your phone away. Although some people will be watching this on their phone. Very interesting and important new book. Your data will be used against you. Policing in the Age of Self-Surveillance. Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, thank you so much for a really interesting conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.